Page 93, Chapter 3, Interrogation. If the intellectuals in the place of Chekhov who spent all their time guessing what would happen in 20, 30, or 40 years had been told that in 40 years interrogation by torture would be practiced in Russia, prisoners would have their skulls squeezed with iron rings, and a human being would be lowered into an acid bath, that they would be trussed up naked to be bitten by ants and bedbugs, that a ramrod heated over a primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal, this secret brand, that a man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot, and that in the luckiest possible circumstances, prisoners would be tortured by being kept from sleeping for a week, by thirst, and by being beaten to a bloody pulp. Not one of Chekhov's plays would have gotten to its end, because all the heroes would have gone off to insane asylums. Yes, not only Chekhov's heroes, but one normal Russian at the beginning of the century, including any member of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, could have believed or would have tolerated such slander against the bright future. What had been acceptable under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich in the 17th century, what had already been regarded as barbarism under Peter the Great, what might have been used against 10 or 20 people in all during the time of Baron in the mid-18th century, what had already become totally impossible under Catherine the Great, was all being practiced during the flowering of the glorious 20th century, in a society based on socialist principles, and at a time when airplanes were flying, and radio and talking films had already appeared, not by one scoundrel alone in one secret place only, but by tens of thousands of specially trained human beasts standing over millions of defenseless victims. Was it only that explosion of atavism, which is now evasively called the cult of personality, that was so horrible? Or was it even more horrible that during those same years in 1937 itself, we celebrated Pushkin's centennial, and that we shamelessly continued to stage those selfsame Chekhov plays, and though the answers to them had already come in? Is it not still more dreadful that we are now being told 30 years later, don't talk about it? If we start to recall the sufferings of millions, we are told it will distort the historical perspective. If we doggedly seek out the essence of our morality, we are told it will darken our material progress. Let's think rather about the blast furnaces, the rolling mills that were built, the canals that were dug. No, better not talk about the canals. And maybe about the gold in the Kolyma. No, maybe we ought not talk about that either. Well, we could talk about anything, so long as we do it adroitly, so long as we glorify it. It's really hard to see why we condemn the Inquisition. Is it really hard to see? Wasn't it true that beside the autos de fe, magnificent services were offered the Almighty? Is it hard to see? It is hard to see why we are so down on serfdom. After all, no one forbade the peasants to work every day, and they could sing carols at Christmas too, and for Trinity Day the girls wove wreaths. The exceptional character which written an oral legend nowadays assigns to the year 1937 is seen in the creation of fabricated charges and tortures. But this is untrue, wrong. Throughout the years and decades, interrogations under Article 58 were almost never undertaken to elicit the truth, but were simply an exercise in an inevitably filthy procedure. Someone who had been free only a little while before, who was sometimes proud and always unprepared, was to be bent and pushed through a narrow pipe where its sides would be torn by iron hooks and where he could not breathe, so that he would finally parade to get to the other end, and at the other end he would be shoved out, an already processed native of the archipelago, already in the promised land. The fool would keep on resisting, and he thought there was a way back out of the pipe. The more time that passes without anything being written about all this, the harder it becomes to assemble this scattered testimony of the survivors. But they tell us that the creation of fabricated cases began back in the early years of the organs, so their constant salutary activity might be perceived as essential. Otherwise, what with a decline in the number of enemies, the organs might, in a bad hour, have been forced to wither away. As the case of Ch.3 makes clear, the situation of the Checo was shaky even at the beginning of 1919. Reading the newspapers of 1918, I ran into the official report of a terrible plot that had just been discovered. A group of 10 people wanted to, it seems they only wanted to, drag cannon onto the roof of an orphanage. Let's see, how high was it? And shell the Kremlin. There were 10 of them, including perhaps young women and youngsters. And it was not reported how many cannon there were to be, nor where the cannon were to come from, nor what caliber they were, nor how they would be carried up the stairs to the attic, nor how they were to be set up on the steeply sloping roof. And so they would recoil when fired, so they wouldn't recoil when fired. How is it that the Petersburg police, when they were fighting to put down the February Revolution, took nothing heavier than a machine gun up on the roofs? Yet this fantasy, exceeding even fabrications of 1937, was read and believed. Apparently, it would be proved to us in time that Gulag case of 1921 was also fabricated. In that same year, 1921, Ryazan Cheka fabricated a false case of a plot on the part of the local intelligentsia. But the protests of courageous people could still reach Moscow, and they dropped the case. That year, too, the whole Zapopolite Committee, part of the Commission on the Use of Natural Forces, was shocked, familiar enough with the attitude and the mood of Russian scientists at the time, and not being shut off from those years by a smokescreen of fanaticism. We can indeed figure out, even without archaeological excavations, the precise validity of that case. Here is what Doyarenko remembers about 1921. The Lubyanka reception saw for those newly arrested, with 40 to 50 truffle beds, and women brought in one after another all night long. None of them knew what she was supposed to be guilty of, and there was a feeling among them that people were being arrested for no reason at all. Only one woman in the whole cell knew why she was there. She was a socialist revolutionary. First question asked by Yagoda, "Well, what are you here for?" In other words, you tell me and help me cook up the case. And they say absolutely the same thing about the Ryazan GPU in 1930. People all felt like they were being imprisoned for no reason. There was so little on which to base a charge that they accused TV under a false name. And even though his name was perfectly real, they handed him 3 years via a special board OSO under 5810. Not knowing what to pick on, the interrogator asked, "What was your job?" Answer, "A planner." The interrogator, "Write me a statement that explains planning at the factory and how it is carried out. After that, I will let you know why you've been arrested." He expected the explanation to provide a hook on which to hang the charge. Here's the way it went in the case of the Kovno fortress in 1912. Since the fortress served no useful military purpose, it was decided to eliminate it. At that point, the Fortress Command, thoroughly armed, arranged a night attack simply to prove its usefulness and in order to stay where they were. The theoretical view of the suspect's guilt was, incidentally, quite elastic from the very beginning. In its instructions on the use of red terror, the Czechist Latzis wrote, "In the interrogation, do not seek evidence and proof that the person accused acted in word or deed against Soviet power. The first questions should be, what is his class, what is its origin, and what is his education and upbringing? There is your separate polite committee for you. These are the questions which must determine the fate of the accused." On November 13, 1920, Jarzynski reported in a letter to the Cheka that slanderous declarations are often given the green light in the Cheka. And so many decades have they not taught us that people do not return from there, except for the small, brief intentional reverse wave of 1939. One hears only the rarest isolated stories of someone being turned loose as a result of interrogation. And in such cases, the person was either imprisoned soon again, or else he was let out so he could be kept under surveillance. That is how the tradition arose in the organs. But the organs do not make mistakes. What about those who are innocent? In its dictionary definition, Stahl makes the following distinction. Quote, "An inquiry is distinguished from an investigation by the fact that it is carried out to determine whether there is a basis for proceeding into an investigation." Unquote. On sacred simplicity. The organs have never heard of such a thing as an inquiry. Lists of names prepared up above, or an initial suspicion or denunciation by an informer, or any anonymous denunciation, were all that was needed to bring about the arrest of the subject, followed by the inevitable formal charge. The time allotted for investigation was not used to unravel the crime, but, in 95 cases out of 100, to exhaust, wear down, weaken, and render helpless the defendant, so that he would want it to end at any cost. As long as ago as 1919, the chief method used by the interrogator was a revolver on the desk. That was how they investigated not only political, but also ordinary misdemeanors and violations. At the trial of the Main Fuels Committee in 1921, the accused, Makrashkaya, complained that her interrogation she had been drugged with cocaine. The prosecutor replied, if she had declared that she had been treated rudely, that they had threatened to shoot her, this might be just barely believable. The frightening revolver lies there, and sometimes it is aimed at you, and the interrogator doesn't tire himself out thinking what you are guilty of. But shucks, come on, talk. You know what this is about. That was what the interrogator Kakin demanded of Skripnikova in 1927. That was what they demanded of Vitkovsky in 1929, and 25 years later, nothing has changed. In 1952, Anna Skripnikova was undergoing her 5th imprisonment, and Sivakov, the chief of the investigative department of the State Security Administration, said to her, "The prison doctor reports you have blood pressure of 240/120. That's too low, you bitch. We are going to drive it up to 340 so you'll kick the bucket, you viper. And with no black and blue marks, no bleedings, no broken bones, we'll just not let you sleep." She was in her 50s at the time, and if back in her cell, after a night spent in interrogation, she closed her eyes during the day, the jailer broke in and shouted, "Open your eyes or I'll haul you out that cot by the legs and tie you standing up to the wall." Standing up. As early as 1921, interrogations usually took place at night. At that time, too, they shone automobile lights in the prisoner's face. The Ryazancheka, Stelmach, and at the Lubyanka in 1926, according to the testimony of Berta Gandal, they made use of the hot air heating system to fill the cell first with icy cold and then with stinking hot air. And there was an airtight cork-lined cell in which there was no ventilation, and they cooked the prisoners. The poet Gulag was apparently confined in such a cell, and Berta Gandel also. A participant in the Yaroslavl uprising in 1918, Vasily Alexandrovich Kasyanov, described how the heat in such a cell was turned up until your blood began to ooze through your pores. When they saw this happening through the people, they would put the prisoner on a stretcher and take him off to sign his confession. The hot and salty methods of the gold period were well known, and in Georgia in 1926, they used lighted cigarettes to burn the hands of prisoners under interrogation. In Matiki prison, they pushed prisoners into a cesspool in the dark. There is a very simple connection here. Once it was established that the charges had been brought at any cost, and despite everything, threats, violence, tortures became inevitable. And the more fantastic the charges were, the more ferocious the interrogation had to be in order to force the required confession. Given the fact that the cases were always fabricated, violence and torture had to accompany them. This was not peculiar to 1937 alone. It was a chronic general practice, and that is why it seems strange to read in the recollections of former execs that torture was permitted from the spring of 1938 on. There were never any spiritual or moral barriers which could have held the organs back from torture. In the early post-war years, in the Czechoslovakia Weekly, the Red Sword, and Red Terror, the admissibility of torture from a Marxist point of view was openly debated. Judging by the subsequent course of events, the answer deduced was positive, though not universally so. It's more accurate to say that if before 1938 some kind of formal documentation was required as a preliminary to torture, as well as specific permission from each case under investigation for each case, even though such permission was easy to obtain, then in the years 1937-38, in view of the extraordinary situation prevailing, it specified millions of admissions to the archipelago had to be ground through the apparatus of individual interrogation in specified, limited periods, something which had simply not happened in the mass waves of kulaks and nationalities. Interrogators were allowed to use violence and torture on an unlimited basis, at their own discretion and in accordance with the demands of their work quotas and the amount of time they were given. The types of torture used were not regulated to every kind of ingenuity, and every kind of ingenuity was permitted, no matter what. In 1939, such indiscriminate authorization was withdrawn, and once again, written permission was required for torture, and perhaps it may not have been so easily granted. Of course, simple threats, blackmail, deception, exhaustion, enforced sleeplessness, and punishment cells were never prohibited. And from the end of the war and throughout the post-war years, certain categories of prisoners were established by decree for whom a broad range of torture was automatically permitted. Among these were nationalists, particularly the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians, especially in those cases where an underground organization existed or was suspected that had to be completely uncovered, which meant obtaining the names of everyone involved from those already arrested. For example, there were about 50 Lithuanians in the group of Romualdas Skyrius, the son of Pramis. In 1945, they were charged with posting anti-Soviet leaflets. Because there weren't enough prisons in Lithuania at the time, they sent them to a camp near Velsk in Archangel province. There some were tortured, and others simply couldn't endure the double regime of work plus interrogation, with the result that all 50, to the very last one, confessed. After a short time, news came from Lithuania that the real culprits responsible for the leaflets had been discovered, and none of the first group had been involved at all. In 1950, at the Kubyshev transit prison, I encountered a Ukrainian from Dnipropetrovsk who had been tortured many different ways in an effort to squeeze contacts and names out of him. Among the tortures to which he had been subjected was a punishment cell, in which there was room only to stand. You shoved a pole inside for him to hold on to so that he could sleep for 4 hours a day. After the war, they tortured corresponding member of the Academy of Sciences, Lavina, because she and the Alleluyas had acquaintances in common. The Alleluyas, that's Stalin's wife's, the one who ended her life. It's his wife's maiden name. So that's the end there. I'll take a break. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.